So first and foremost, just wanted to talk a little bit about the people on this call. We have Sean Montgomery, as Art mentioned, who is our CEO. We have Jack Antikadjian. He's our Chief Revenue Officer and Head of Operations. We have myself, who's Head of Product, and then Michael, who is our Customer Success Lead. We're a super hands-on team. We're all here today, and we're all really excited to be here. So just really quick, a little bit around how this is going to go. First and foremost, I'm going to give like a very quick 10-minute introduction on really what the backend is and its role in application and software development. We're then going to go through 40 minutes of a build session with Sean, where he's basically going to go through and build a two-sided marketplace like Airbnb. We're not going to talk about dependencies today, and that means like integrating payments and integrating things like email via SendGrid, but we will do kind of the end-to-end of how you build the database structure and all the API calls. So you're going to learn a lot from this. And then finally, we'll leave 10 minutes for Q&A. So as we're going, please drop your comments or questions in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to them all. Couple more things. This meeting is going to be recorded and shared. So if you are following along and you don't necessarily follow in that exact minute, you can always watch this back and learn a little bit later. We're also going to be sharing a backend snippet. If you don't know what that is, basically everything that we're building today, we're going to share with you, so you can actually start from where we're building. You can learn with it, or you can use it or leverage it to kind of continue building your application. And for those that stay to the end, we're going to apply a $100 credit to your Xano account after you attend. So we're going to kind of take an attendance list at the end, and we'll apply it to your email address or your name. So if you haven't signed up for Xano, please go ahead and do so. go.xano.co/ncd. And yeah, with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. So first and foremost, just what is Xano? And we like to say that Xano is the fastest way to build a powerful, scalable backend for your application without code. But in order for you to like understand the value of what this means, you kind of have to know what the backend is. And the way we like to say about, or just talk about software development today, there's the front end and the back end. And I know a lot of you may know this already, but it's a good primer as we move forward into this build session. The front end is what the user sees and interacts with, and the back end is all the business logic and stuff behind the scenes. It typically consists of a server, a database, and an API, which we'll talk about in a minute. The best and easiest example to understand the dynamic between these two is the Amazon one-click buy. So on the front end, on Amazon's website, you might see that buy this now button, but in the back end has to do things like check inventory to make sure that payment method is okay, to check the distribution centers, to check inventory. There's so many things that the backend handles and that's really what Xano enables and does in a no-code way. So thinking about the parts of the backend, that server, the database, and the API, let's go through a very quick example that I always like to give people a better sense of how an API and database and server work with one another. I always like to use the example of a restaurant metaphor. And in this restaurant metaphor, you have a customer. That customer places an order with a waiter, like I want a cheeseburger with extra onions. That waiter then will take that custom order and pass it over to the kitchen to make the order. Kitchen gives the waiter the cheeseburger and makes a happy customer. In this metaphor, the customer is the front end, right? So they are passing a custom order to the waiter, and the waiter is the API. They're the messenger that runs from the front end and brings it to the kitchen, which is really the heart of your backend. That's the server and the database. And the server really dictates how fast the customer gets their food, and the database is like how many cheeseburgers are in my kitchen. So for people that don't really understand the concept of an API, they're that messenger that runs back and forth. And when you think about what Xano provides, we do the waiter's job and the kitchen's job, right? So everything that you need in the back end, that fast server, that really flexible and scalable database, and that API messenger, we provide you this no-code API builder in order to put it all together. And so just very quickly, a lot of people like to ask, well, why should I build on a separate no-code backend like Xano versus like an all-in-one solution like Bubble, for example, right? So there's a couple reasons that I'll take you through really quickly. The first is just best practices is to have one backend to many front ends. So you might have, for example, your web application in something like Bubble, which is great, but you might also develop a native mobile application, or you might have like a CRM portal for your partners or your administrators, and you want one centralized backend to power all of those front ends. The second thing is for code development. If you're working with a lot of different people, it's really hard to have workflows mixed when you have your front end workflows and your back end workflows. It's easy to step on each other's toes or get confused. And so Xano, having this separation of that back end makes it really easy to just basically understand what's going on and understand the business logic on the back end side and the workflows on the front end. The third thing is just around transforming and storing data. This is something that Xano has really expertise in. We basically only focus on the backend. We're front-end agnostic, and we make it very easy to transform data from any source, which you're inevitably going to do when you build out your project. And then finally, we're built for scale. Just kind of related to the point before, we basically are very transparent about the infrastructure that we build on. We're on Google Cloud. We orchestrate or we provision your instance with Docker. We scale with Kubernetes, and we're on the world's most powerful open source database, which is Postgres. So happy to answer more questions around that, but just wanted to explain a little bit more around why it's important to use something like Xano, a no-code backend, certainly separately from the front ends that you're using. Our mission as an organization is really to empower anyone to build, launch, and scale unique software applications to the world. And the reason why unique is highlighted is because typically what makes your application unique that you're building is that 99%, the complexity that is required, right? So when you're building typically with a lot of these no-code tools, they might take you 80% of the way, but we believe 100% is necessary to make innovation happen and really launch the amazing products that you want to push out into the world. And to that end, we're Turing complete. Basically, we want to say that we're the first and only Turing no code complete backend out there, which means anything you can define with software, you can also do within Xano. So with all of that said, I'm going to hand this over to Sean to start this building session of the two-sided marketplace. Again, if you have any other questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat. Sorry, I sped through this. I just want to make sure we have enough time for the build session and to give you enough context to around what Xano is. So I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to you, Sean.
Awesome. All right. Let me also make sure my video is back on. Okay. You guys see the screen? All right, let's get started. So we're going to do a two-sided rental marketplace. So the first thing is we need to pick the database schema, or at least, first the model names that are important. So the first one is obviously we're going to have users, and we're going to, for the user table, we're going to have that both be customers as well as the owners of these rentals. And I'll flesh that out in a second. We also are going to have a residence. That's going to be what we are renting. We also need to see availability. And so that would be like, as you click on a residence, you're going to see like, oh, Tuesday and Wednesday are available, but Thursday and Friday are booked by someone else. And then last but not least, we're going to be using a booking table, which is going to keep track of that transaction. All right, so let's get started. All right, so what I just did, I just basically told Xano the high-level components. It then built out a bunch of APIs to kind of get us started. I won't be using those because I'm going to do everything from scratch just so you guys see how all this stuff works. So the first thing is, now that we have our database fleshed out, we're going to start adding schema to these tables. All right, so we're going to go into residence. The first thing is you probably want to have a title of the house. You probably want an address. You want to know who owns it, so that would be a user. And then let's see, title, address. Also, we would want, so I'm going to be using I'm going to be sprinkling in a little bit of geo, so we can say, show me residences near me. So even though we have the actual full address, we want to actually store that as a latitude, longitude point. So we'll also put that. And I think that is all we need for this at the moment. So I'm going to say house A, just going to pick some quick metadata, house C. I've got my notes up here where I've got a couple of addresses pre-filled out. So I'm just going to paste those in here. All right, so these, the Woodland Hills ones are close to each other on purpose. I then have another one in Westlake, which is a neighboring city. And then, so we'll have to fill out the user in a second, and then latitude, longitude. So here, we're going to put in the point. All right, so we got the first point.
And just as Sean is building this out, so this is our database spreadsheet viewer. It's very similar to a spreadsheet if you've worked with Airtable before, but we have more field types outside of Airtable, like location being one of them, right? You can store geo, and storing geo allows you to do things like find things near me or draw a polygon around a perimeter that you're interested in. And so we try to make it as easy as possible to manipulate this. And there's all sorts of controls that you can use to, search your data and to add different field types. Sorry, continue, Sean.
Awesome. All right, so I'm going to go. So residences are filled out. I'm going to make 2 users. We'll have Sean and Prakash. Sean at Xano.com. And I'm going to have Prakash be the owner of these 3 properties. And then I will go ahead and book. Okay, so now we have the super basic residence. The next thing is availability. All right, so availability is, like I said earlier, it's kind of like you would see it almost like a Google Calendar type thing. So each cell of the calendar would technically be a row in this availability. So the first thing we need to do is have a reference to the residence. We then need to have a price, because sometimes Fridays and Saturdays are more expensive than the usual weekdays. So we could do price. And then we need to know the created at, we're going to reuse that field for the actual day. And then we need to know whether or not something has been booked. So that will just be the presence of a booking ID reference. So if booking ID is 0, it means it's available. Booking ID is not 0, it means someone has used it. So I'm going to add a couple records here. We'll do house A. We'll change this date to, so we're just, even though, so this, since I'm reusing the timestamp, technically there's a time, we're really just kind of using the date for this example. So we got the 25th. We'll do the 26th, and we'll do 27th. Okay, we got house A, and I'll do 2 more. Do house B. Okay, and then 25th is okay, and we'll change that to 26th. All right, so price for this, we'll say $100. 125, 150, and then this one will be 100 for both of them. All right, so then these are already, so right now everything is completely available.
Sean, but before you move forward, just talk at a very high level. Just go back to the view with all the different tables. Talk at a very high level around why you structured things this way. Like you've got user, resident, booking, availability. How do you think about it, especially when someone is building a 2-sided marketplace? How do you think about structuring your tables or your database schema?
Yeah, so really, so there's definitely different flavors of 2-sided marketplaces. There's Uber type situations. But anytime you're doing a rental, really the key component is that calendar view, right? Because you can those are units that you are trying to acquire or reserve or sell, depending on your perspective. So really the trick is how do you represent that and allow people to reserve those units? So there's a couple different ways to do it. You could say, oh, well, maybe you can pick a range, but that tends to get like cause more trouble than it's worth. Maybe you want to book something in the beginning of the week, but you want to book something in the tail end of the week, but not the middle. So how would you do that with a range? That's kind of where it falls apart. So the nice thing about having this availability record, it's super clear. And the reason why this works is because you're only booking physical days. You're not booking like a couple hours of a day. If you were doing that, that would be a different story. But because it's physical day blocks, it makes it very easy to see what's available and what's not. Right. So that's kind of the strategy around that.
Yeah, and you can keep going, but you'll notice that there's the user and then the residents. That's like typically in any two-sided marketplace, there's a demand side and the supply side, right? So the supply side is like the addresses or the homes that are available, and then the demand side is the users that are requesting it. So Uber, it would be the people wanting rides, and then for the supply side, it would be the drivers themselves. And so he's kind of done this demand and supply, and then to his point, this view on the calendar to where it's very clear what the availability is, and he'll keep demonstrating this as we move forward.
Awesome. All right, so the last table is the booking. So this is where you would be exchanging money. Since we're not using third-party dependencies for this particular demo, basically we're using pretend money, right? So just the presence of this indicates that some type of transaction would take place. So a booking needs to have a user who did it. This would be the guest. And then we also need to know the residents. And then, because remember I said that you're actually like picking different blocks or cells in this calendar metaphor. We would then do another table reference of availability, but we would change that to a list, because because you can actually book more than one day. So I would change this to a list. Perfect. And then I guess the cherry on the top would be if we actually stored the total, because there's different prices for different cells. Okay, so I think we have our schema fleshed out enough. There's a chance maybe I missed something, but we can always come back and fix it. So the next part is actually creating the APIs that we would use if we had this app already working. So let's just talk through real quick what these APIs would be. So normally you can imagine you load up your app. You would probably want to see residences near me. So that's where we're going to sprinkle in that some of that geo magic. So I should be able to see and be able to have a preference on what is the radius you want. So maybe residences near me within a couple mile radius, right? So, and then once we see those residences, you would imagine clicking on a residence. So once you click on it, then it's all about that calendar view. So what is the availability of this particular residence? Once you have that, then you would want an API to actually make a booking. And that booking would be, so your UI would be, you can imagine clicking different cells. And the booking API would be responsible for making sure that anything you booked, anything you sent to the API is actually available. So you don't want someone to steal someone's reservation. So we'll do a little bit of precondition logic in there. And then once the booking is done, really, it's I'm oversimplifying this, but once it's done, you would then have a list of your bookings as a guest. And if you're the landlord, you would see a list of bookings that have been rented, right? So it sounds like 5 or 6 APIs. And let's just quickly dive into this. Okay, so the first thing is residences near me. So I'm going to do.
And just as Sean is building that, you'll notice that already all of the CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, all of those API endpoints were created for the tables that he defined, and also all auto documented. So Xano basically keeps this all documented and synced with anything that you do. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, so residence is near me. So all we need for that is we need our own geo point, which we'll then use when we create, do the query conditionals here. So this would be, so you're on your phone has a GPS, your whatever front end you're using would be able to get that GPS, and then you would send those values, the latitude and longitude value as an input here. So once we have that, we then need to get a list of residences near me. So the first thing is, let's get residences. And then let's actually see if this works. Also, I have, hold on.
And while he's pulling this, if you've never seen this before, this is Xano's no-code API builder. There are 3 sections. The first is the inputs, which, as Sean mentioned, this is the query parameters that you're getting from the front end. So what we want for this API endpoint is your location. Where is this user at this time, right? So that is the location that we're pulling in. The second piece of that API builder is called the function stack, and that's where the power of Xano really lies. It allows you to put in a linear fashion, functions that execute and then return into section 3, this response. That's what's being returned to the front end.
Yeah, so I just copied the format from another residence. So technically it's as if I'm on top of that residence. But we're not doing any geo just yet. We have an input, but the input isn't being referenced anywhere. So right now, because we haven't done any conditionals, it would be all residences. So it's house A, B, and C. Remember, we have Woodland Hills is all in similar close range, where Westlake is the neighboring city. So now, instead of 3 records, like if I'm in Woodland Hills, I should just see Woodland Hills residences. We can now come in here and tweak the query. So here we would come in and choose the resident location, and then we want to do a filter, which is within. So determine if one geometry is within the supplied radius of another geometry. So the other geometry happens to be the input, because remember, we're sending in the input. So we're comparing the location of a residence with the location that we're sending in from my phone. And then we'll pick a distance in meters, let's say 3,000 meters. I think that's a couple miles. Actually, let's put maybe 5,000. And then equals to true. Okay, so if this is correct, already with that same input, and this one of these inputs is already that one of those residences, it should, assuming I got that 5,000 meters correct, it should only have 2 results instead of 3. Awesome. So if I came back and changed that to, let's say, 50,000 meters, I'm guessing that's probably within the Westlake Village radius. It should then come back to 3. There we go. So that just shows you that the radius is working. We'll bring it back to 5,000. Okay, so now we have our first API, which is show me residences near me, right? That's pretty cool. Technically, we could put the radius as an input, but for now, I think it's all good saying with the server side picking what that radius is. Okay, so the next one is availability of a residence. All right, so this would be availability of residence. Okay, so this, all we need here is a residence ID, and then we want to do another query all records with availability. And I'll do this in steps so you can see the difference here. So like the previous endpoint, right now we have an input, but the input isn't doing anything. So technically what this is doing right now is a global list of all availability. So that, I think we did 5. Yeah, that makes sense. So, but we actually want to see availability for a particular residence. So the same way we did the geo conditional, we can now do one, which is basically lining up the residence ID to the residence ID input to the residence ID of the availability table. And if I do this little database preview, you can see, here we go. Right, we're just mapping one field to another. All right, so then here, residence equals input residence. Pretty straightforward. And then if we do run and debug, instead of 5 records, so we'll do property 1, I think that should be 3. 1, 2, 3. And if we do property 2, that should be 2. And then property 3 should be nothing because we didn't do anything. All right, so far so good. Okay, so the next one, and this is definitely the meat and potatoes of all these endpoints, is the actual booking, because we want to make sure that someone isn't booking over someone else, right? So let's look at residence 1. So let's say I want to book day 1, so the 25th and the 26th, right? So let's go make that API. All right, so we'll call this book residence. I'm going to change that to post. This time we need user authentication. Okay, so what inputs do we need? We need first a residence ID. Then we need a list of availability IDs, plural. So we'll change that to a list. We can also say, there's some nice convenient filters in here where you can say, I want a minimum of 1. We don't want people to book a residence with 0 availabilities, because that would just be a free transaction. So this basically throws in a conditional for our convenience to say we always need you to at least book at least 1 cell or 1 day. And I can show you how that works. So we can say, also, so Xano has for authentication, Xano uses JWE tokens, which is industry standard, which is how to basically store stuff in a secure manner that has been vetted by security professionals. And the existence of that token, if it can be decoded properly, means you are who you say you are. So to get that token, normally you need to log in with your username and password, or through OAuth if you're doing like a Google login. But when you're debugging, that can definitely get annoying. So we have a real nice convenience factor here. You just click and say, I want to book as Sean. It automatically puts that token in. So that's only for administrators of the Xano account. So the first thing is, I wanted to show you that filter working. So we want to book residence 1, but we're going to say, oh, actually, I'm trying to just screw things up here. I want to book residence 1, but I'm not going to pick any days. Right? So already it says, this is basically our first lightweight precondition. At least 1 items are needed. And then if we put in an ID, it should be good, right? So that just means that the inputs passed. We haven't actually fleshed out what the function stack should be doing. Well, let's do that now. Okay, so the first thing is we want to actually get a residence, I think. Maybe we, there's a chance we actually don't need to get the residence, but I'm just going to get it. And we'll see if we can get rid of that at the end. So then we also need to do a for loop to loop through the availability IDs, get those availabilities, make sure that those availabilities actually have the right residence. Sometimes people whether intentional or not, could pass in availabilities for other properties, so potentially mixing and matching. You wouldn't do that if you were using the app, but sometimes people are trying to sneak in and find ways to break things. So let's first start with the loop. So we're going to do a for each loop. Once we have this for each loop, we're going to loop over the availability ID, which is a list, and then we'll call that avail ID or availability single ID, just so it's a little clearer. Okay, so we're looping through that. Once we loop through that, we want to then get availability. Okay, so we want to look up availability by availability single ID. So each time we iterate through that loop, availability single ID represents that ID in that list. So now we've actually gotten that availability object. We then want to make sure it matches the residence ID, so that we would do a precondition on that. And I'll show you how these preconditions work in a second. So we're going to do residence ID should be equal to availability. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. Availability dot residence ID. Right. So all a precondition is you're trying to guarantee that an expression is true. So we can say no mixing and matching. Okay, so let's first see if we can have that precondition trigger. So if we just have one availability, so this should work. This should just give us, it's not actually booking it because we're not done finishing this, but this shouldn't have any problems. Okay, so that's good. If I change this availability to, I think to 4 or 5, which should be a different house, it should throw an exception. It did. No mixing and matching. All right, so far so good.
So before you continue, Sean, maybe high level, go over what is happening in the function stack right now.
Yeah, so the whole point of this function stack is to just create a booking object. We haven't done that yet, but when you create that object, so that represents basically the contract as a renter with the landlord, right? So you want to make sure that that contract is accurate, right? That's why, like, you wouldn't want to have a contract with one landlord, but have availabilities linked in from another house, because that just causes a whole bunch of issues. So all this is really just to guarantee that input is as you would expect, right? In a perfect world, you wouldn't need this, but it's very easy to sometimes have a mistake in your front end, and this just guarantees that everything is as you would expect. Okay, so if this loop succeeds, it means technically we're ready. Actually, we forgot one more thing. We need another precondition to know if an availability has been used by someone else. All right, so we'll do one more.
So as you're building this precondition, I think an important thing to note is that as you're building any software application, there are always nuances and these subtleties that can throw off your application, throw off the user, or break your application entirely. So what we're showing here is really best practice ways to basically prevent the user from doing something that you don't want them to do. So it's important to kind of think through these different use cases and all of the scenarios as you're building out your function stack, which is kind of what Sean's doing with you now.
Yeah, exactly. So the first precondition is saying, hey, we're trying to book residence A. Let's make sure all these availability objects that you send over are the right ones. The next one is, let's make sure all of them have a booking ID of 0, which means that no one has reserved them yet. Okay, so if this loop completes running, it means we're now ready to actually make that booking object. All right, so now we're going to do add record. booking. All right, so here we have user ID should be the authenticated user. Oops. There we go. Residence ID is the ID we passed into the input. All right, that was pre-selected just because it was a familiar name. Availability ID, which is actually a list, maps to the availability ID in the booking. So that was another one. And then we have total. Okay, so I forgot to do total. I'm just going to put 0 there for now, but I'm going to go back here and make the total. So what we want to do here, I'm trying to think how we want to do this. So we'll do create a variable called total, set that to 0. So this is going to be, we're going to be doing a little bit of math here and bring that back up here. Okay, and then after the preconditions happen, I can then do some basic math. And I want to add, my existing variable is total, and I want to add, what do I want to add? Availability, I think dot price. I think that's right. Let me just double check that.
And Sean, just as you're going through, we got about 10 minutes.
All right, I'm almost done. Availability is price. Okay. All right. So we have a variable total, starts out as 0. Each time we loop, we're then incrementing total with the price. And then we can now, instead of 0, we can swap that out for the real one, which is right there. Okay. So let's book. So I think that's done. Now we're going to book, we'll book availabilities 1 and 2 of house A. And let's see if everything, we can get rid of this. And we will return booking.
So you can return any item that you want in the function stack. And so now that Sean has completed this, he's returning the very last item, which is booking 1 for the result of the successful function stack run.
Yeah, so I'm going to be booking, remember we wanted to book the 25th, which is today, and 26th. So that's just items 1 and 2. Let's see if it works. Okay, awesome. And total works as well, because I remember I think the first availability was 100 and then 125. So 100 plus 125 is 225. If we then try to book this again, so just doing the exact same thing, it should throw an error. Uh-oh. Oh, I forgot to set, I just realized what I did. I forgot to update the booking. So we're going to do one more loop. All right, availability ID, we'll do same name. Actually, I can just clone this. It'll save me some time. Get rid of that. All right, so basically what I'm doing here is I am doing another loop, but we can get rid of all this stuff. Whoops. Okay. All right, no pressure here. All right, so now we're going to update a record. So we're going to update the availability. And we have availability single ID. All we care about is updating the booking ID. And I just realized I need to put this. So first we need to create the booking and then we can update it. So I have to drag this below that. We're then going to update this with booking1.id. Okay.
And just explain why you had to do that.
Because the availabilities need to know the booking ID. So you actually have to create the booking ID first, or the booking object to get the ID. All right, so I'm going to go back here real quick. I'm going to delete those 2 bookings. We'll pretend those never happened. Come back here. So now if I book it, same thing, this should still work, all right? But if I try to do it again, it shouldn't because those bookings have been taken. All right, this availability is already being used. So let's just quickly go back here. You'll see booking availability. Let's go, actually, I wanted to go to availability. You'll see that these are now referenced to booking ID 3, okay? All right, couple minutes left. I'm gonna rapid fire through this, but the last remaining APIs are now that a booking has technically taken place, you wanna see, you probably wanna go to My Account. Both people wanna go to My Account, the landlord and the renter, and see My Bookings, right? So those should be very similar. We'll say My Booking, My Guest Booking. We'll change that to authenticated. All right, don't need any inputs on that. So we're gonna do query all records. I guess bookings. All right.
So what you'll notice a lot of the times is that in the function stack, we use the query all records function, and then we always kind of do a filter on that. And that's a really easy way to basically query all the records in the database, obviously optimized for whatever you're trying to get. And so we've done this like 3 times in this demo now. That happens a lot when you're building out backend functionality.
Yeah, so I just did booking where user ID is the authenticated ID. That one was the easy one. I'm then going to now make the other one, which is from the landlord's perspective, which is slightly more complex, but not too bad. So I'm going to clone this. So my landlord booking. All right, so the reason why this is a little bit more complex is because we need to do a join. So a join is when you don't have, because we need to map the authenticated ID to the owner of the residence, which is not available in the booking. But from booking, we can traverse to residence because we have table references. So the first thing is we want to map booking.residence ID to residence.id. All right. And then now we can do our conditional. So now we have access to the residence table, and we want to say user ID is equal to the authenticated ID. All right. So if I rerun this, it technically should not return anything because this is, I believe, Sean's token. If I change this to Prakash, it should because he's the owner of the property. All right, there we go. I think we can pause there. There's still, obviously this is like we're doing this as quick as possible, but hopefully you could follow along and kind of see how we broke down the core actions. And 100% we're fully aware that these applications, like the things that make these applications better than your competitors is really all the nuance and attention to detail. So there's still more stuff to do here. Integrate with third parties for processing, and also just make the UI really nice on the front end. But this is where it really starts. You need to build the core platform, your MVP, and then you start fleshing it out more and more and more as you're trying to make all these workflows like a breeze to use. And you want to actually make the app enjoyable to use. And part of that is making an API that properly models all of your data and can then manipulate different state like you saw as we were trying to make that booking. And that's
Awesome.
it.
Sean, can you go to the API endpoints that you created? And so we can just like talk through them very, very quickly. So we've been able to do the availability of a residence. Let's
go in order. I wish I should have alphabetized these. But the first one is residences near me. So that started out with just a global list, like give me all residences. And then we added some geo conditionals to do some fancy filtering on a geographical radius with latitude, longitude points, right? So then once we were able to see those residences, which would be on the homepage of the app, We then wanted to be able to click on a residence. And once we clicked on it, we wanted to see availability. And we're using this metaphor of like these different booking cells, and each cell represents a physical day that you can reserve the rental property. So this is responsible for giving you the data to populate those cells. And based on the presence of a 0 value or a non-zero value for a booking ID, you would be able to gray out those cells as, hey, this is available or not. Once you actually book, so then you would have, your app would then, you'd be able to click on the cells that are not used and then call an API to actually book that. That went through, that did some loops and preconditions to just make sure all the data was as we would expect. And then it had to create that booking object. This was a little bit complex just because the order of operations is important. You need to create that booking object first to get the ID so you can then mark those availability objects as taken, right? So you need that ID first before you can mark them done. Once you have that, we're at the tail end here. Depending on your perspective, if you're the renter, you want to see, I want to see my bookings that I've done, just to make sure everything all makes sense. You'd probably see like the address of the property, just so you know when to show up. And then also from the landlord's perspective, they want to see bookings that have been done by their guests. And that was a slightly different, we had to use some database joins to just traverse through the different table references.
Yeah, so yeah, I hope, as Sean mentioned, this gives you like a good sense of how you would get started with this two-sided marketplace thing. I mean, kind of Sean went above and beyond when it came to the different preconditions and making sure that everything was correct before doing it. What you're seeing now is Sean is going to share all the work that he's done in a link. And so you can basically install this on an existing Xano instance, or you can preview it anonymously to check it out, because it's not immediately intuitive how to do this stuff, right? And I think in the combination of looking through this and watching back on the video, you'll be able to understand. We can't emphasize enough that I think this nuance is kind of what's required as you build complex and comprehensive applications and you launch them into the world. And so our job is to try to really make this easy and understandable as possible for you. So outside of doing this, we also have weekly office hours that we do. So if you want to come to us with your unique problems that you're trying to work through, we're happy to kind of go through those with you. So as Sean is sharing this out, like if anyone has questions that they want to ask, then feel free to put them in the chat and we can go ahead and respond to them. I know Michael's kind of been proactively answering some of this stuff, but yeah, we can go through it. So I'm already seeing a question come through from Mark. And so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and ask a couple of these questions, Sean, and then maybe you can respond. And then Art, if I can also ask you to unmute Michael, because I'll have to go in a couple of minutes and let him share his video, then he'll also be able to field some of these. So the first question from Mark is, and by the way, thank you all for attending. I really appreciate that. So Mark says, does Xano handle complex queries, including based on geodistances, and deliver fast response times? So complex queries, including geo, and do we handle fast or deliver fast response time? Sean, you want to answer that?
Yes, 100%. So we're piggybacking on Postgres's handling of geospatial data. So basically, we're relying on them to make sure that it's fast, and they've been around forever. It is super fast. To get super technical, just for a split second, it's all handled by what is called a GIST index, G-I-S-T, which is a whole bunch of smart people figured out different ways to organize data, which then makes it easy to say, hey, am I near you? Am I within a radius? Is this shape intersecting with other shapes? All that stuff is handled in Xano, and it uses all the proper methods of Postgres to make that super fast.
Awesome. Second question is just kind of around our scalability. I think people generally want to look for guidance around how they can think about building and understanding how they get from MVP to scale. A lot of that work is obviously handled by Xano. So maybe talk about that at a high level, Sean, about what we handle and what they need to handle on their own.
Yeah, so scaling is definitely a broad term. So the first thing is how does your infrastructure scale? So everything on Xano is orchestrated through Kubernetes, which is basically Google saying, this is our software to handle scale. I know everyone is aware of how huge Google is. Google even uses their own software. So at the end of the day, if you need to scale your infrastructure up, because we're relying on Google's Kubernetes, it means that we would be scaling just the same way they would be doing, right? So we still have different packages. Like if you get the lowest package, it's not going to be as good as the highest package, but all those packages are different configurations in this Kubernetes environment. And we can even create custom packages. So we can get as crazy as you want, which should make you feel better that it's under control. And we're relying on Google's technology to make sure that that happens. Another thing is, so ideally you don't want to rely on infrastructure to scale, right? You can do your own part to make your application more efficient. Like if you're able to make your queries more efficient, technically you could have one API that can handle more requests in a particular package than another one. So one way to do that is with database indexes. That's an advanced option inside your database tables in Xano, but you can choose certain fields to make queries faster. So an example of that would be, we were showing bookings that I have done, right? So that references the user ID. So that would be a good example of, okay, seems like a lot of people are going to be doing bookings that they have done. We probably want to index on the user ID. We have a lot of documentation on best practices around that. So this is super high level, but that's just an example of where you can make things faster on your own so that you don't have to rely on the infrastructure. Eventually you'll have to get there, but you want to delay that as much as possible to keep costs low.
Hey, this is Art. This question was asked and answered by Michael, but I think it might be good for the benefit of the group. The question was, just to talk through it for a second, can I import a schema table into Xano?
Can you import a schema table? So right now, the easiest way to import is we have a really, really good Airtable import that handles all your Airtable bases. You can even filter it on different views in case you don't want to have certain data showing up, and it preserves all the relationships. So right now, that is our best way to get data in if you've already done it somewhere else. We're still working on making it more flexible. Like we want to be able to import from MySQL, from native, your own Postgres, all the popular databases. We're just not there yet. Right now, the easiest path to get in, if you already have your data schema modeled, would be through Airtable.
Awesome, thank you.
Great. So Prakash left, so we'll go back to one of Mark's questions here. And he's asking about integrations with big data and or AI platforms. So he's asking if that's possible via Zapier or other no-code tools. So maybe just talk about how we can do integrations with the external API request.
Yeah, absolutely. So anytime you're talking about an integration with another service, it's really just bringing your data to them. So you can do that. And the easiest way to do that is just on demand. If it's fast enough, you might as well just do it because it makes it super easy. So one example would be when you are actually making that booking. Where did I book residence, right? Okay, if this completes, so booking a residence, that seems like probably a valuable piece of information. It also has financial information like the actual price. So all it would be is just an external API request. All these different big data systems, segment, mixed panel, There's a bunch of ones with AWS and Google. All of them have an API to ingest data. So you would just type in the URL up there and then decorate the payload however they want. If they have, so a lot of these vendors have examples with curl, which is it's a Linux utility to basically send an API request. If you have those, it's literally copy paste and it does the API for you, which is super convenient. So if you ever see a curl command, you definitely want to select that, copy it, and do import curl because it just pre-fills all this data for you. Sometimes it's a little annoying. Different vendors do things different ways, and it can sometimes be a little confusing. But if they have an example with curl, it's super easy.
Great. And then another question, what type of apps is Xano a fit versus not a fit for at a high level?
Good question. So in the beginning, we said Xano is Turing complete, which means it can do anything a programming language can do. There's an asterisk on that. And trust me, I don't want there to be an asterisk, but if you had to do crazy math, like 100-page math formula, that would be difficult to do. It would be possible to do, but would it be feasible? It would not be feasible, right? So if you're doing something that extreme, you would definitely want to put that in your own microservice. You still would be able to use Xano to do the business logic and glue everything together. But for something that particular, that there's better tools for things like that. But if you're querying data, manipulating it, transforming it, doing conditionals, checking if things are all good, I mean, it's a breeze in Xano. Hopefully you guys saw that while I was doing that on the fly.
And then how rich is the scope of developer contributed modules? Is that the marketplace?
So the marketplace is all, we've got a handful of templates and extensions, like in user authentication. You can see different OAuth solutions. We've kind of got the big players. We even have Magic Link, and then we have Outset as recent, which is a no-code one. These are all the marketplace ones are currently done by us. There's a handful. This is not exhaustive, but we're trying to use what the majority of people will use. We're constantly updating that, but anyone in the community can create a snippet. So that's what I just did at the tail end, right? Anything you do in Xano, you can publish to a snippet, which then goes to xano.com/snippet, right? So we have different ones here, and anyone can publish those, and then people can even try these out anonymously. Similar to CodePen, you're like running JavaScript anonymously, you don't need an account. You can actually preview the snippet without even having an account in your own environment. And if you and you can tweak it, you can make changes to it because it's a copy of the data. And if you like what you see, maybe you make some changes that you like, you can then promote that anonymous account to a real account. And so this is constantly getting updated. This just got launched last week, so it's definitely new. But I think this is very powerful to just allow the community to start creating one-off solutions for anything, like different flavors of different components. I mean, you can do whatever you want here, which is pretty cool.
Looks like we have just a couple more questions right now. First is how to link a Xano table to an external table of same or similar format.
So how to link it to an external table. So that really kind of depends on what you mean. But if I'm gonna make a guess here. So let's say we have an Airtable table that we're not importing, but we still want to make some type of reference. So we could say maybe this, and I'm just doing this on the fly here, but let's say that for some reason availability also needs to reference availability table in Airtable. So all you would really do here, you just do Airtable external ID, right? I'm just using text. Different vendors have different ways they format those IDs. Sometimes they're numbers, sometimes they're not. So it probably would just look like that. So by having that external ID, if you then needed to maybe, I don't know, synchronize something, maybe let's say Airtable is handling your pricing for these houses, but you then want to synchronize it with Xano. I think that's a good example. So you'd have different Airtable IDs here, ABC 123, ABC 321. You could then have a background task that is scanning these availabilities, doing an API to Airtable with this ID, because now we actually know what they map to, and then updating the price. I think that would be a pretty cool example of having data in two different places, but synchronizing them. Hopefully that was what you were getting at.
And then looks like the last question for now, is there a way to view the behind the scenes code in your function stack?
So you cannot see the actual, the real programming code. Unfortunately, you cannot do that. We may expose that at some point, but any of these marketplace items and snippets, you're able to dig in. I mean, it's an exact copy of what we just did. So you can see the functions that were used and how they're configured, like this. If there's a function here, like currently I'm not using a function, but we have a list of functions which allow you to share your function stack in other APIs. Like maybe you have a 10-step process to do something, but that process needs to be in 5 different places. That's where you would wrap it in a function so you could reuse it. You can still peek under the hood there, but like we do not support seeing the particular code for like getting a record from a residence. We might explore that at some point, but right now that's not doable.
I could ask one question. This is Art again, just to sort of wrap it up. I want to definitely respect everyone's time as well, but how is multi, if you had a small team working on a project here, how would that be handled? Are you able to work in a team-based environment within Xano?
Yeah, so if you go back to on a per instance level, you can manage team members, and different packages have different team members. We're still trying to make this as cool as like typing a Google Doc. Like that experience is amazing. Right now, we're not there yet. So really our guide, you can still work on things in parallel with team members, but really best practice at the moment is if I'm working on a particular API like book residence, someone else should not be. They can work on other APIs or functions in the Xano workspace. But like right now, if you do multiple saves at the same time, we throw an error saying someone else has been updating that. So we're not there yet for that perfect Google Doc collaboration experience for the same API endpoint, but you can definitely work on different things at different times.